Today we're going to talk about putting a figure or figures in a landscape and how to deal with them, how to focus more on the figure than the landscape, eliminate all that's unnecessary. Today we are looking at painting a figure in the landscape. And the landscape could be a setting like this, a street scene or a cafe, just some kind of setting where the figure is in a setting as opposed to sitting in a studio in a chair and you're just painting a three-quarter view. Here the figures are in a setting and we're trying to do the same thing that we do when we paint a landscape. We're trying to suggest the light on the figure and how it affects the form. And the more we can simplify that, the better. Now, you may not be that interested in the figure, but as an exercise, it does force you to really consider shape and drawing a bit more. We want to do that in a regular landscape, but we really have to do it in a landscape where there's a figure in it. Or in this case, two figures and a dog. And like anything else, the first thing we want to consider is the composition. And most of these photographs, or all of them, have too much in them. And we identify the focal point as being here. So we want to decide what we can eliminate. And the more we can eliminate, the better. The more clutter we can get rid of, the more the figures are going to become important. And in this one, the only thing that matters to me is the figures and the dog. Everything else can disappear as far as I'm concerned. I don't have to render a building back in here, certainly not chairs in the background. All this stuff is just excess clutter. It might make a nice painting, but not this one. This is about the figure. So really commit to eliminating what's unnecessary. So I want to first crop what's unnecessary. I don't want the figures being too centered, so I'm going to place the figures a bit to the right. So I want them to the right, not too close to the edge on the right side, but close enough that the figures are not centered. And that's going to work a little bit better. I also don't want them centered up and down. So I have more foreground here and less space up above. I don't want it even. I could probably have a bit more foreground in there just to keep them from being centered up and down as well as side to side. Then what I want to get rid of course, is this stuff. Even the texture on the wall does not interest me. I think it would be distracting. But certainly everything else is real distracting. So we want to think about how to get rid of everything. And I want a value in the background that's not the darkest dark, because it's going to be too far away back here to be the darkest dark. So my darkest dark is going to be in the figures. So I want a value back there that eliminates too much contrast. I don't want a real light light, and I don't want a real dark dark. Now what I could do is I block in that, and I also want a color that's going to make the colors on the figure stand out. So I usually go with more muted neutral colors and maybe add color to them. So if this color is an orange and blue, that color there, then I can come back and scrub into it while it's wet, kind of a dioxazine purple, viridian, maybe blue and alizarin to make a violet, but something that's going to stay back in the background but give a little bit of color but stay grayed. And the background can be abstract. I can go ahead and put in here for a little balance on this side, window of some kind or doorway or something, but I can't have it too dark. Just have that balance out on that side a little bit. But I want to simplify the background, simplify this stoop they're sitting on, and the values in the foreground. Now, I probably want the value in the foreground to be a bit warmer as it comes towards you, which I didn't do it on this, but I would warm it up. Still keep it muted, but just a bit warmer. Then as it goes back, it can get a little cooler. But this way, the figures stick out. They aren't centered. And I play around with the composition a bit more. I have a lot of space there, so don't hesitate to try 5 or 6 different ways to crop it. The figures are a bit more vertical, so probably a square or a vertical composition would work best. But also a longer composition would work here as well. So let's just look at this vertically. Still with the idea of getting rid of all the clutter, and I want more on the foreground than I do on the background. So I got to make sure I don't make it centered from top to bottom. In other words, less space between the heads and the top of the picture than on the bottom. And that's a little bit more. 8 by 12, maybe 11 by 14 would be too square for that. But think about the shapes and sizes and then get rid of stuff that's unnecessary. Now I can have some subtle value change in the background and subtle value change in the foreground from here to here or from there to there and all across here. So maybe a little bit darker around the heads and it gets lighter as it goes out this way. And this can get a little bit lighter as it goes back that way. So some value change there. But this allows the figures to pop out more. Now suddenly it's not about anything except the figures, and there's nothing in there that's going to distract the viewer from the figures, which allows me again to get a little variation in here, maybe a tiny bit back in here. So moving on to another one. Same thing here. I'm interested in the figure, maybe a little bit of the background. Part of the horse, part of the carriage, but not everything I see here as far as the horse and carriage goes, and certainly not the figure here and the background statue, no interest, even the trees. I might use some of the tree color and value in the background, but all that is just unnecessary. This brick area, no interest. If I get caught up in that, and it's easy to, because all that stuff looks interesting in themselves, but together they don't make a good composition. So I want to crop first. And since he's more vertical, I would probably create more of a vertical shape. And again, I want more foreground up above. So I'm going to crop the horse a little bit. If I'm going to, well, horse is already cropped in the photograph. He's missing his head. So if I want to show the horse, I have to probably show a little bit of that leg. Otherwise, it looks like he's floating. There we go. So he's off center. He's a little higher than he is down near the bottom of the canvas, a little bit centered sideways from side to side. So he's too much centered here, just kind of dead center. So I'd want to offset that a little bit. But value and color wise, as far as the background, this is what I meant by showing some variation from foreground to background. It's gradually getting lighter, and that gives it depth. But I don't have to render anything. I want the brushwork to take over here. Simplified brushwork that keeps it from looking like a photograph. Brushwork that's big and simple, not blended out necessarily. Same thing with the background. I have cooler, grayer colors than like the coat, the hat. Nothing in the background be as dark as his hair or some dark accents on the figure. And just enough of the horse and carriage to show some interest. And I would probably move the figure over just a hair this way, or maybe not, maybe this way. I don't want him centered. I have him a bit too centered. If I'm going to have the longer shadow here, then I would move him over to the right just a little bit. This one, same area. Both these were in New York. First one was in Greece. And any place I go in the city, I'm always looking to take photos of figures doing something in the street. They always make good paintings. And again, here, I don't want to show the whole horse, because then everything becomes squeezed into the picture plane. So I'm going to have more in the foreground than I am in the background. And again, I would make this probably a bit more vertical. I think that composition works better. The horse is cropped on the rear end, so it looks like there's more space behind the horse. And he's not centered up and down. In other words, he has more space down here than up here, and that makes the composition work better. It gets him off center, more interesting. So really think through that. It's, for being, I think, the most important part of the painting, nobody pays attention to it hardly at all. We all want to get to the color and the rendering and the brushwork. But this is so much more important. And also, and I do this with the thumbnails too, getting rid of the background. Of course, it's just going to be black and white when you do the thumbnail, but it's still simplifying the background, not worrying about the shapes of the truck back there or the shadow of the truck or even the brick. I want it warmer up front in here, warmer, and then it gets cooler back in here and slightly lighter as it goes back. But I don't care what this is. I don't have to render anything. I just have to have a shape there that's subtle and lighter than the figure and the horse, at least the bridle stuff on the horse. That way the figure sticks out. If I have my darkest darks in the background, then the figures don't stand out. The background comes forward. So in this case, I want the background dark, but not nearly as dark as the figure. The other thing, but putting your dark in the background, things get lighter as they recede. So you wouldn't ever have your darkest darks in the background. Of course, you never say never. Usually don't. And then this one, a lot of clutter around it. Of course, we're not interested in any of this stuff. This might be an option here, but all this, the benches, the traffic in the background. We don't have to paint everything that's in the reference. Now, this is in Central Park. I might want to suggest the trees or the sidewalk to show at Central Park, maybe even the musician back there. But the more stuff I add, the less interesting the figure is. You're drawing attention away from him. So he's cropped pretty good already. He's probably a bit too centered. Probably move him a bit more to the left, just a hair. Let's go ahead and just do that. So I'll take a little bit off the left side and have everything on the right side showing. But he's definitely a vertical composition. Now his horn runs off. I would go to Google trumpets and find one and see how it looks. I don't like cutting off the horn there. So the composition would be a bit taller to include the end of the horn there, because cropping that off doesn't help it any. What I want to do here, I want a little bit of the feel of the trees and the shrubbery and the sidewalk, but don't render it so much that it becomes distracting. Now I could get even a suggestion of the bench back in here. There's that bench, a little bit of the railing in there, and that would suggest a little bit more of Central Park, but I don't have to do that. And even that's a bit distracting. But I would mind a little bit of the figure in there, or maybe some sky holes. But the minute I start seeing too much, really loses interest. So when I eliminate clutter and all those little value changes, there's a lot of little value changes, but when I get rid of them, the figure really pops out. And again, a little warmer in the foreground, slightly lighter and cooler as it goes back. No hard edges back in here. Between shrubbery and sidewalk, everything is soft. Keep all my hard edges on the figure. And the figure is going to have hard and soft edges. In the Photoshop version, there's no soft edges because I'm not going to take the time to soften stuff. But I would want to lose some of the edges that are slightly rounded, like right in here. Maybe the roundness of the shoulder or the head, or maybe the roundness here of the arm. I could just soften those edges a little bit and leave a lot of the other edges a little harder or a lot harder in some cases. So a variety of hard and soft edges and getting rid of clutter, but using whatever I have in the background as a contrast to make the figure stick out. So I got a little darker in these areas, in here and here. That's more around the focal point. Then I would have those be my darkest darks, and as I move away from there, get a little bit lighter as far as the darks go. The last one here, this is a food cart in Central Park. And again, a lot of clutter, especially on the cart itself, which I like. I want to show a lot of the cart, but I want a value that's simplified here. Too many value changes. I don't necessarily want a white board, but I want a muted colored board with a little bit of variation, but not much contrast and not much detail. Same thing at the background. Background's pretty simple, just pulling it together a bit more, and then have these figures stick out here, and I would get rid of these figures. So my cropping here, and I would again want to kind of vertical, maybe chop off a little bit of the umbrella on the left, and I want, in this case, I don't want to center the cart and the umbrellas vertically too centered either, or horizontally. So I want more sky and trees. And I'll put this down a little lower, or I won't have the bottom be as low. So now I have more sky than I do foreground. The rest of the images, I have more foreground than sky. So everything's kind of off-center. That's going to be real important. These figures here are off-center. This figure's off-center. Of course, these figures are gone. So now as I simplify it, I want to get rid of a lot of the variation in the background, the hot dog sign, the figures in the background, simplify the trees more. So there's what I'm looking at. If I start with pulling the darks together, and in this photograph, it's one of the reasons I took it, all this dark kind of holds together in here on the cart, in the background, and then underneath here. It all kind of creates that shadow pattern that makes it easier to see So in my simplification, I want to make sure I pull that together, and that means everything in the background is going to be lighter than that. I might have some shadows back in there, like right in here, and have these somewhat dark to make the umbrellas pop out, but nothing will be this dark. And when I start painting, after I get the block in, the big color block in, I will get some value variations and color variations in these deep shadows. But even when I do that, I still want to keep everything big and simple. So I can break up the shadow pattern, a little bit of subtle color variation and value variation, but I don't want to lose that shadow pattern. A little bit of foreground and the shadow in the foreground to break that up, but really simplicity in that background. I can turn this into a wall by getting a shadow underneath the top part, or some pillows where I see a little bit of the green background, but not much. I need to keep focus on the figures. And I always want the idea that I'm going to be spending more than half the time on the figures in here, and the other half goes to everything else, or less than half. So we'll start first with the drawing, which will be all transparency, not necessarily transparent colors, but a lot of paint thinner and no white. And we'll get these big shapes, the simplification set up. And I won't be focused on detail at all, but we'll spend more time on it, getting the proportions right and making sure the composition is set up. That makes the painting so much easier. And when you have something like figures, which are more complicated, spend more time in the drawing stage. So the first parts will be the drawing and the values, and then the color.